Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for our special Arthur Eiler Institute seminar highlighting biodiversity actions taken in response to the recent Western Victorian bushfires. I'm James Todd, Chief Biodiversity Officer and ARI Director, and I'll be chairing this seminar with technical support from Andy and Lauren. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land we're joining you from. I'm on the land of the Wurundjeri people, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. I'd also like to extend that acknowledgement and respect to the traditional owners on the lands you're all dialing in from today, and to any traditional owners and Aboriginal people who might be with us. I'd also like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional owners of the country that was impacted by the Western fires that is the subject of today's presentations. So I'm really excited about the three presentations we've got today, which is looking at the Western Victorian bushfires through a biodiversity lens. The seminar will use case studies of threatened species to explore how biodiversity values are identified, monitored and addressed during bushfire events. Rather than providing a full overview of the Western fires, it offers insights from three individuals involved in the Western Fires biodiversity response. For this seminar, we are incredibly lucky to have three great presenters from three partner organisations. Dr. Sarah Garnick is the Manager of Forest Biodiversity Policy in DEECA's Biodiversity Division, and Sarah will be sharing aspects of DEECA's rapid risk assessment and prioritisation of conservation actions after the bushfire events. Marcello Bold from Parks Victoria and Garryword will be shedding light on the on-ground actions Parks Victoria led to support threatened species, including provision of supplementary habitat and monitoring programs. And finally, Dr. David Cantrill, the Chief Botanist and Executive Director of Science at the Royal Botanic Gardens in Victoria, will be discussing RBG's role in the complex process of flora recovery from planning, response and to hopefully ultimate recovery. We'll take questions at the end of the presentations as a panel session, so please post any questions that you've got throughout the seminar for Andy and Lauren to collate, and I'll be chairing that at the end. And we'll go as long as we can go, and we may not get to all the questions, of course, that you might have. So with that, I'll introduce Sarah again. Sarah's the Manager of Forest Biodiversity Policy in DEECA's Policy and Strategy branch in Biodiversity Division. Her team provides advice on managing forest-dependent threatened species across DEECA's land management activities, and Sarah had a lead role in DEECA's biodiversity response to the Garryword bushfires, leading small mammal prioritisation work in that space. So over to you, Sarah, and thank you.
Thanks, James. So yes, as James said, I'll be talking about some of the work we did last summer in prioritising actions for threatened species after those fires. So I'll just start by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people today and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. So our systems for incorporating threatened species information into emergency management have significantly matured since the state they were in before the 2019-2020 summer bushfires. And I'll be talking through how we understand and prioritise action for threatened species using a case study of small mammals in Garryword. But I'd first like to touch on some of the decision support tools that we use. And our goal is really to have a consistent set of data and information so we can that we can use to answer a range of biodiversity questions in a consistent and repeatable manner. And these systems and information help us understand what's happening and where, prioritise what species and places we're worried about, and understand how to act, what we should do and where. So a really key underpinning decision support system we have is what we call strategic management prospects. And this is a spatially explicit landscape scale approach that helps us identify the most efficient and effective management actions to benefit biodiversity. And this is made up by a number of different information sources. And a really key one here is habitat distribution models, or HDMs. And these are models that consist of observations of where species occur with a range of environmental characteristics such as terrain and climate. We also have some models that help us understand where threats occur in the landscape. So known locations of things like deer and rabbits, also plus a suite of environmental characteristics. We have what we call benefit of action models, which are site and situation specific settings, which we use. We get experts to provide us their best guesses and best information about the benefits of these actions, and we can then extrapolate those from sites to landscapes. And finally, we have information on the costs of actions, which is expressed as dollars per hectare and incorporates time, space, and other cost components. And together, this really helps us identify the best actions to do for biodiversity. We also have a relatively new tool which we call habitat value. And this is a spatially explicit view of the relative rank of biodiversity assets to help us compare locations across Victoria. So in this map here, the areas with the highest biodiversity value are in dark blue and the lowest are in yellow. And what this does is it combines information such as habitat distribution models, but also records of species occurrences, plus the extent of native vegetation, and uses some software called zonation to help us combine and rank all locations across Victoria based on their ability to represent as many of Victoria's plants and animals as possible. And this is a really useful statewide ranked view of biodiversity value. And finally, this last map is a draft kind of work in progress, but this is a new product that we're working on between ARI, Arthur Riley Institute and Melbourne University in a research project, which is helping us identify and manage the risks of future fire regimes to biodiversity. And what this map does is it incorporates the consequence of the next fire for biodiversity. And I've used a Flora example here, which is based on the fire interval, whereas fauna is based on the time since fire. We then combine consequence with likelihood of the next fire based on some new fire modelling called Risk 2.0. And we've used the worst possible fire conditions to give us the worst possible potential. And when you combine consequence and likelihood, that generates this risk map, which we can see here, which has, it's a summed risk of over 3,571 plant species, with yellow being the areas of highest risk to plants under the next fire, and purple is the lowest risk. And this is helping us understand where there are concentrations of species which were vulnerable to that next fire. And once we have this information, we can then start to identify actions that will help us to address that risk. So whether that looks like different fuel management regimes, or it could be something like, for the context of plants, managing overabundant herbivores, or it could be some targeted actions like seed banking, which is what David will be talking about later. So when an incident happens, we get pretty quick understanding of what is happening and where. So this footprint on the left shows the fire footprint in the little desert fires, and this is almost real-time input on the fire spread. And we get this information updated multiple times throughout the day. The second map on the right is of fire severity within Gary Word, and this relies on cloud-free images, but we get this within weeks of an incident happening. And this helps us understand a little bit more detail on what happened and where. So once we understand what has happened, we can start prioritising which species and places we're worried about. And we answer these questions using data analysis, but also consultation with local land managers and species experts. So some of the things that influence whether or not we're concerned about a species is which species is involved, how much of their range, and are there any important sites or populations that were impacted. Vulnerability also influences our concern for them. So what's the response of the species to fire? Are they fire killed? Does the fire increase vulnerability to subsequent threats like increased pests or sedimentation? And also, what's the status of the species? Is this a listed species? Is it locally endemic? Or what does that look like? So when we run through some of our data analysis, we can get a table of outputs that looks like this. So we get the species of interest, species that are in the area of interest, and we can get some really quick information about what is their status under the Flora and Fauna or Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. We can understand how much of their modelled habitat was within that incident, and also how many of their records are within that footprint. We're working to incorporate some more traits-based information to these outputs, such as are plants fire killed. And this, as I said at the start, this process was developed to analyse many different sorts of impacts, such as fire or floods or storms. And the intent is to have a kind of single way of looking at these problems that can provide answers to multiple questions. So the way we did this for threatened small mammals in Gary Word was that we ran an initial desktop analysis. And in my list here, we have 8 small mammal species that were either listed under the Flora and Fauna Guarantee or the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act and had more than 0.5% of their statewide modelled habitat within the fire footprint. The notable exception is I don't have brush-tail rock wallaby on my list, but that's because recovery actions were already well underway for that species. And so what we did, as I just described, was we combined information on their habitat distribution models plus their observations, overlaid that with a fire footprint, and we get some information such as the percent of their statewide suitable habitat that was within the fire footprint, also what percent of their statewide records, and there's a little number of records in brackets. But also to get a bit more of a zoomed in view, we looked at how much of their modelled habitat within the Grampians bioregion was within the fire footprint. So this is our really quick kind of desktop understanding, but we then further refined our list of species of interest by talking to some experts. So the bottom 3 taxa dropped out. Fat-tailed dunnart and brush-tailed phascogale dropped out of the list because, as you can see, there were no records within the fire footprint, and experts agreed that the species were unlikely to occur there. Whereas platypus dropped off the list of concern because experts identified that their key catchment was unimpacted by this fire and so weren't really a priority for post-fire recovery actions. But the spatial analysis doesn't fully capture that vulnerability of species to fire, and so we often refine that with some trait and threat data. And this is just a reminder that, species experts and local knowledge is critical here. So the outputs of that tool, it's an internal tool which we kind of call Biodiver. It's really intended as a conversation starter to help experts focus on the species of most concern. And I've got an image here of this happening, one of the expert workshops that we ran in January 2020 to help prioritise recovery actions following those fires. Another really key input to prioritising vulnerability is the rapid risk assessment, or RAT teams. And where an incident is large enough, these teams are deployed and they help understand vulnerability by rapidly identifying, assessing, prioritising and evaluating risks on public land. And these are multidisciplinary Victorian government teams which do these risk assessments on public land following a major event. This could be bushfire or flood or something else. And it's sort of a measure of how big the past fire season was that we had 3 of these teams deployed over that past season. And the intent of these deployments are to produce a report within a 7-day deployment that identifies those risks, some feasible treatments and cost estimates for risk mitigation. And the biodiversity discipline focuses on the impact and ongoing threats to environmental values, including threatened species. And indeed, one of the key outcomes from this report was that the rats identified elevated risks to small mammals in the post-fire environment. And this final report also assists the incident management team and land managers to transition from that response phase to recovery, and is really useful in helping support funding applications, initiating recovery planning, insurance claims, and helps determine workforce planning beyond that pure suppression phase of the incident. Something else we stood up in the past fire season was this interagency collaboration. And big shout out to Mark White for facilitating this. So this was a working group that met quite regularly and involved a wide range of stakeholders and land managers. And the key kind of outcomes of this group was it facilitated knowledge transfer and also established some partnerships to help deliver recovery projects. And we used this group to provide some initial expert input on what needed to happen for that small mammal recovery. So finally, once we know what's happening and what we're the most concerned about, we can start thinking about what should we do and where. And as you know, some recovery actions must happen almost immediately, such as the supplementary feeding for brush-tail rock wallabies, but other actions need to occur in the kind of months and years following. And DEECA's decision support tools, including strategic management prospects that I went through at the start, and also specific needs assessment, can help us further refine and prioritise our action. So threatened species also require detailed or tailored actions as part of planning and management to maintain and improve their long-term conservation outlook and prevent extinction. And so what specific needs assessment does is it supports planning for those species that require more targeted conservation actions. It helps us to estimate the benefit and cost effectiveness of alternative management scenarios. And as I said, it helps us identify where we need targeted management, such as supplementary feeding, in addition to typical landscape scale management like herbivore, predator, and weed control. Another part of this process also involves multi-factor prioritization, whereby we can incorporate external factors such as technical feasibility, political or community strengths, and funding alongside those pure estimates of benefit and cost effectiveness. And in the context of this process, what I mean by benefit is the change in probability of persistence for a species in 50 years' time due to the management actions, whereas cost effectiveness is that benefit per unit of cost. And that's where some of those benefits of actions and cost of actions layers that I spoke about at the start come in. So how did we apply this for small mammals in Garrawerd following the fires? So we used expert elicitation through the specific needs assessment process to identify priority actions for the next 12 months to assist small mammal populations to eventually recover to their pre-fire status. And this is really critical to keep in mind what I mean when I say recovery here. So in the context of threatened species, we typically think of recovery as the species is doing well enough that it no longer requires listing. However, in the context of fire recovery, we're talking about returning to that pre-fire status. And some of the triggers for this work were that we had elevated risk to small mammals identified by the rat teams, but there was also an external proposal to salvage and or translocate some of these species. And so we ran through that list of prioritised species that we came up with. And to remind you, those were southern brown bandicoot, long-nosed potoroos, smoky mouse, heath mouse, and the common dunnart. And for each of these 5 prioritised species, we asked a number of questions. And these included estimating the impacts to the species on the probability of persistence of those fires. We estimated the benefit and cost effectiveness of the existing post-fire threat management that was already occurring, and we identified and assessed the benefit and cost effectiveness of any additional actions that might be required to help support recovery to that pre-fire status. So the way we ran this was through 2 online workshops with an internal facilitator. Sorry, my animations are a bit whack on my slide, but we'll just push through. We invited 13 experts from across DEECA, Parks Victoria, Catchment Management Authorities, Museum Victoria, academic and non-government organisations. It was really important to get this wide range of expertise in our team doing the elicitation. And as I said, experts assessed the benefit and cost effectiveness of 9 management actions under 3 environmental conditions for a total of 18 scenarios. And so what this looks like is our base case was the fires did not occur and we had rain as per climate predictions. But because we know that rainfall is a really key predictor of recovery for small mammals, we had 2 different alternatives where we have poor rainfall for the next 3 years, which was defined as below average, or good rainfall, which was average or better. And under our fires did not happen base case scenario, we look at the imaginary scenario whereby no threat management occurs. And this is important because it establishes the counterfactual for assessing the benefit of the pre-fire predator herbivore management continuing for 20 years. So this is our kind of base case for understanding benefit of anything else. And under the real world situation where the fires did occur, we have those matching counterfactual scenarios of no management or committed 12 months post-management as our baseline for benefit. All of the subsequent actions build on this 12 months committed post-fire actions, then return to pre-fire BAU management. So we have a first suite of actions which involve those 12 months of committed actions plus either more fox control, plus adding on cat control, or plus adding on herbivore control. These are all about existing predator control actions. We then had some scenario that looked at protecting unburnt refuge habitats, because we know that that habitat is really important for small mammals to hide from those predators. And we then looked at those scenarios whereby we just salvaged individuals, taking them out of the population, or we salvaged those individuals and then subsequently reintroduced them back into the population. And so the key message from this work was that rainfall in the next few years is a key driver of recovery. So what this figure shows is the probability of persistence along the y-axis with the red dashed line at 0.5. And 0.5 probability of persistence means there's an even chance of the species going extinct. And the time frame for this process was 20 years. I have each of the species represented as a different little shape combination on the side. So we've got southern brown bandicoot, long-nosed potteroo, smoky mouse, heath mouse, and common dunnart. And then our 3 different environmental conditions down the bottom. So this was the probability of persistence for the species pre-fire. If we get average to above average rainfall in the next 3 years, what this is showing us is that existing threat management, so that's the already committed predator and herbivore control, is likely sufficient to enable those populations to return back to their pre-fire status. However, if we get below average rainfall, we're going to need to consider some additional threat management actions to offset the impacts of the fire and those dry conditions. And what are the next actions that we should consider implementing? Well, the most beneficial and cost-effective action that came out of this process was protecting unburnt refuges for the next 3 years. And this is such a beneficial action because of the importance of cover for small mammals. And it's really cost-effective because it's sort of a do-nothing type of action. Interestingly, the benefits of additional fox control were higher than those for herbivore control. And it's likely due to the fact that controlling predators has a really direct impact on small mammals, whereas herbivores have a slightly more indirect impact through browsing and trampling on habitat quality. When we looked at scenarios which salvaged individuals from the population, that reduced the probability of persistence, and that's likely due to the impacts on the residual population. However, when we looked at a future release of genetically mixed individuals, this management scenario carries those populations through the post-fire bottleneck, but it also increases the capacity of those populations to adapt to future disaster events, including fire. However, this is not necessarily a cost-effective action because of the high ongoing costs associated with the future release program. And so the kind of key take-home message here is that the current actions that we're delivering are assisting recovery of these populations in this place, but pending the kind of climate outlook, it might be useful to explore additional cost-effective actions. And I'd just like to finish by thanking a massive stack of people who contributed to this work. So many people contributed, from developing the data to running the analyses to supporting with the on-ground fire response. This is an enormous team effort, not just within DEECA, but across multiple stakeholders and land managers. And thank you to everybody who's contributed in this space. I'll stop sharing and let Marcello share his.
Thanks, Sarah. Great presentation and a great example of using the best available science and information to support priorities for action. Our next presenter is Marcello Bold, who is a field officer with Parks Victoria working on the Grampians Gary Wood ARC program, which is implementing landscape scale introduced animal control to achieve biodiversity outcomes, including for threatened species. In this role, he supported the recovery actions for endangered and threatened mammal species after the 2025 Gary Wood bushfires and he's also helped to develop predator management plans and monitoring projects. Thanks for attending, Marcello. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Can you guys all see my screen all right? Fantastic.
No worries. Thank you.
Sweet. My name's Marcello Bold. I'm a field officer here with the Grampians ARC, working in Halls Gap on RBG and Jabberong country. And today I'm here to talk to you all about what we've been working on these last 6 months in helping develop and implement a lot of the on-ground recovery works here in Garrywood, which I'm here to talk to you about today. So, as Sarah mentioned, the 2024-2025 fires here in Garrywood have had a devastating impact on the landscape, and that's severely affected a lot of the Grampians ARC's high-value conservation areas, impacting all of our priority species, as mentioned before: southern brown bandicoots, smoky mice, brush-tailed rock wallaby, long-nosed potteroo, and heath mice. And so, following the fires, the PV team, we were pretty quick to re-establish our business as usual bait stations, targeting foxes throughout the park, and ensuring that fox control remained consistent following the fires. We also had some targeted trapping conducted across those high-value areas, managing foxes, as well as coordinating several aerial and ground shooting operations, targeting a range of predators and herbivores in the burn scar. And in this time, the PV team has also been working and developing a cat monitoring plan to sort of help inform future management as they do become a more prevalent threat in the landscape, particularly post-fire. And so that monitoring is currently underway. We've been really lucky as well to be working with a few other partnership groups. So we've been working pretty closely with Zoos Victoria and Museums Victoria, particularly focusing on smoky mice, with 2 populations in Garrywood being monitored post-fire that were impacted, both in the Vic Range and the Mount William Range. And so, as you can imagine, these populations have been pretty severely impacted, but we've had some pretty positive early signs through the monitoring done by museums and zoos who have detected a number of individuals throughout both of those areas. So they're still persisting post-fire, which is good signs. Parks alongside DEECA Uni, we've also been working collaboratively to monitor a lot of the key small mammal species in our high value areas that were impacted by fire, particularly focusing on trying to locate long-nosed potteroos throughout the landscape. As Sarah mentioned before in her slide, long-nosed potteroos are particularly vulnerable to that localized extinction, and 4 of the 5 known areas in which they occurred were impacted by these fires. So it's been critical to assess how they've fared and try and determine where in the landscape they've survived so that we can target management towards them. We're still awaiting results from DEECA Uni, but our own monitoring cameras have been able to detect a range of small mammals persisting in the Upper Glenelg catchment area in particular. And we were fortunate enough to detect, back in March, long-nosed potteroos on the Glenelg River, as well as a number of detections of southern brown bandicoots, agile antechinus, and common ringtail possums. The ARC has also been working with DEECA Uni to re-establish their long-term live trapping sites. They've got 36 throughout the park that have been monitoring small mammals since 2008. So this is a really valuable long-term data set that we've been working collaboratively with. And these surveys just provide that really valuable insight into the long-term effects that fire has on small mammal communities. So far, the uni students have only done 20 of the 30 sites, and unfortunately, it's pretty low numbers at the minute, which is not too surprising, with a total of 14 individuals captured, equating to about 1 mammal per 2 hectares. So just emphasising that severe impact that the fires of this scale have on small mammal communities. But on a more sort of positive note, we have been lucky that we have been able to capture a couple of southern brown bandicoots, as well as a number of native agile antechinus. We've also had some amazing volunteers coming out and helping us carry out the Great Garrywood Bird Survey. We've had a total of 27 volunteers involved this autumn, with conducting 110 surveys across the same 36 trapping sites that DEECA Uni have been doing their long-term trapping in. And they've recorded up to 47 species of bird in this period compared to 66 recorded in the previous autumn, again just showing that impact that the fires had on our fauna community. And unfortunately, again, we did see a pretty major decline in the reporting rates for several common species such as grey fantails, New Holland honeyeaters, red-wattled birds, spotted pardalotes, and white-throated tree creepers. So again, showing just that the immediate impact that the fires have had. And it'll be really interesting coming into the spring when we conduct the next round of Great Garrowwood bird surveying to see if we do see a bit of an increase in those reporting rates. As a part of our fire recovery, we've also been conducting a trial utilising artificial habitat in our high conservation areas in the form of habitat pods. So post-fire, small mammals in particular are left quite exposed due to the loss of vegetation, particularly in those long unburnt, dense vegetated areas. And so we were aiming to utilise these pods and deploy them to help provide and supplement that cover in priority areas where there was just no vegetation left at all. And so we deployed a total of 302 pods in those priority zones, particularly focusing on southern brown bandicoots and long-nosed potoroos, and deployed some monitoring cameras alongside them to assess their use by these native species. These cameras have just been retrieved with the analysis to be undertaken pretty soon and to assess the effectiveness of the pods. They're secured onto the ground with these biodegradable pins, so the pods will be left out in the open until they naturally decompose. And yeah, we've had some, just skimming through the data initially, we've had some good early signs in some of our priority areas with southern brown bandicoots detected in the area and investigating the pods. We have also had detections of predators like cats and foxes in these potted areas, which isn't surprising. What's been a promising sign is that there's been no sign so far of them being able to move or disturb the pods. So that's been a really interesting finding. One of the big ticket items that we've been working on, which was a major focus following the fires, was the recovery and sustaining the population of brush-tailed rock wallabies in Garrowwood. So on Christmas Day last year, the Yarram Gap fire went through the Murra brush-tailed rock wallaby colony, and the team working out of the ICC, we got into contact with the Southern Brush-tailed rock wallaby working group to get the best possible advice that we could, and then worked with the ICC to acquire some aerial reconnaissance as pretty much, I think it was about 2 days after, and got them to sort of take some photos so that we could see ourselves and report to the working group the level of damage that had been done in the area. And as a consequence of the severe scorching across the entire colony area, eliminating all the food source that the wallabies rely on with little to no vegetation left, we determined with the working group that emergency supplementary feeding was critical to their survival. And so we were able to move really quickly within a week. What followed was the establishment of our weekly aerial feeding operation. So we used a mix of helicopters and drones, whichever were available at the time, to deliver care packages made up of lucerne, macropod pallets, carrots and sweet potato into the colony, dropping these packages at 23 feeding points across the escarpment area, just to try and cover as much ground as we could. But yeah, once the fire ground was deemed safe and we could enter the colony area, myself and the ARC team were able to walk into Murra and establish our 17 ground feeding stations, as well as cameras to monitor those stations. So to date, we've done 15 services, walking the colony, resupplying food and water, and checking these cameras. And we'll continue to do this until the vegetation in the colony area recovers, which will be assessed on a week-by-week basis with the ARC team and the brush-tailed rock wallaby recovery group. And so, yeah, in total, out in Murra, we've established 42 cameras throughout the area, monitoring both the feeding stations and the greater escarpment area, seeing who's eating what. We've had a few swamp wallabies and brush-tailed possums moving in the area as well, so it's good to know that there's other natives as well kicking around. But yeah, that camera imagery, it's been really, really insightful into where the wallabies are persisting, whether joeys are present in the area or not. We've been really lucky to see a lot of young at foot in the area, which is a great sign. And yeah, who's using the feed stations. We've also been conducting scat surveys that have been completed and sent through to analysis. So this will provide a really good insight into how many individuals are actually present in the colony, the ratio of males and females, as well as the genetic diversity of the colony. We're also actively monitoring other areas in the Garrowwood landscape for prospective reintroduction sites to sort of help ensure the survival of this species in the broader landscape. And yeah, the preliminary findings from our emergency supplementary feeding and monitoring in general have shown that the wallabies are present across all 17 stations, which is great. It's been a huge range extension from what we previously thought. So they're spread out from the initial release area and populating it, which is awesome. And we've been able to note a number of joeys and juveniles present in the colony, which is a promising sign for recruitment and the growth of the colony. Sharing photos with the working group as well, we've been able to assess that the individuals look healthy. They're not all skin and bones, but the supplementary emergency feeding is actually contributing to their diet and meeting their nutritional needs. We've got one of the individuals over here in the bottom left with the green ear tag. He's the only tagged individual in the colony. And so by noting where he's been moving throughout the area, we've been able to assess, how far he's moving, on a weekly basis. And he's, I think, tacked up to about 3 kilometres back and forth. So moving pretty far for a brush-tailed rock wallaby. We'll be continuing this ground feeding operation into the winter whilst the landscape continues to recover, hoping that we can get enough rain so that come the spring, we can begin to wind down. And that will sort of be informed by our work and discussions with the working group. We've got another sling loading operation booked in this week to top up supplies at each station. So that's exciting for the program going forwards. Finally, I'd just really like to thank all those in the local and regional PV team who have contributed so much to these projects, as well as our amazing volunteers, partner organisations such as DEECA, ZOOSVIC, Melbourne Museum, Deakin Uni, Adelaide Uni and Melbourne Uni, as well as land care groups, friends groups and the wider community for getting around this project so much and their continued support. So, thank you very much.
That's great, Marcello. Thank you very much for a really quick run through of the great work that PV's been leading, both in response to the fires and obviously, before you could safely get access to the fire ground and what you've been doing since. Really fantastic work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just a reminder, folks, that we'll come back to questions at the end as a panel. So if you've got questions, please put them into the chat and we'll try and get through those as best we can. Our final presenter today is Dr. David Cantrill, who is the Chief Botanist and Executive Director of Science at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Victoria. His role is to oversee the management and enhancement of the State Botanical Collection held at the National Herbarium. And these collections support bushfire recovery, species discovery, seed banking, conservation genetics. We're really privileged to have David present to us today. Thanks, David. Over to you.
Great. Thanks very much, James. And 2 really great talks that have set the scene, particularly Sarah showing, how we've gone about planning and implementing responses, but also the monitoring that Marcello and the work Marcello's team at PV are doing. I guess before I start, probably one of the things with plants is, the initial response is really an assessment exercise, and because so much of the vegetation has been damaged, but equally it does provide often limited opportunities to salvage. But generally these are around cutting material and other things where possible rather than seed banking. What I want to talk about today is a little bit about the conservation seed bank and how that plays into this space. So the Victorian Conservation Seed Bank contains about half of our listed species in the state of vascular seed plants, keeping in mind that there are over 1,500 in the list, so sort of 700 or 750, which means we don't have complete coverage, and that's something that we're working towards. But also the seed bank contains other things. So there are 39 spore-bearing plants that are listed, and a whole lot of non-vascular plants. And these things, because they don't produce seeds, are not traditionally seed banks. And we've got a research program looking at how to bank these things, spores using minus 147 degree freezers and other processes that we're having some success with. And the other group, of course, that is in this space are fungi, which are so critical to many of our species, particularly threatened species. And we've got protocols in place for putting them into suspended animation in minus 80 freezers, so we can bring them back, and we regularly bring them back for a range of our conservation programs. But the limitation that we've got really at the moment is that although we've got that coverage, is the population sampling is sparse for many taxa, and there's often limited seeds for some taxa because they don't produce a lot in the wild. Seeds are really an effective insurance policy against extinction in terms of cost, but also ongoing maintenance, much more effective than maintaining ex situ collections, but we can only collect them at certain times, and often that's not lined up with fires. We really need to collect prior to the events. But there are a range of other methods that we use at the gardens to conserve or provide material for conservation back into the wild. Ideally, in most cases, in situ protection of survivors is sort of the really critical thing here. But ex situ collections, where we take cuttings or other material that we can propagate off, is another way of generating plants for putting back into the wild post fire and when we're in the recovery phase. I think the other critical thing here is knowledge around the biology of the plant. So Sarah talked about the trait analysis, and we've often got a lot of gaps in this space in terms of our understanding of how plants will respond to big events like this. And so part of our remit here is to create that knowledge so that we're better positioned for the decision making, whether that be around dependency on pollinators or germination requirements that things might have, or other aspects of their biology. So what I want to talk about a little bit now is just a practical example, not in Garryword, but one of the other fires, the fire at Mt Cole that happened last year. And the Mt Cole fire, although a lot smaller in scale than Garryword, does show some of the impacts that even smaller scale events can have. So this particular fire heavily impacted Grevillea Mt Cole, the Mt Cole Grevillea. We can see it's really just confined to that Mt Cole area, just north of the highway, and the plants themselves are really quite susceptible. They are totally killed by fire. They're not at all resprouters. Even lightly burnt plants will suffer. Recruits come up in large numbers following the fire, or have done. But the question is how many of those will go on to produce mature plants that will replenish the soil seed bank. And of course, some of those things are really dependent on what the subsequent seasons are like. Are we getting a very dry or period like we've had, or is there adequate water? And so monitoring the post-fire recovery is really important here to understand how this particular species will go into the future. So despite the dry summer that we had, we only saw 5% mortality, and this is work that ARI has been doing out on the ground in collaboration with the gardens. The other thing is that there was an opportunity to transplant seedlings. So some seedlings were transplanted to more appropriate sites, off tracks and things where they had come up, but we saw higher mortality in those, around 35% mortality. And I guess our concerns around what might happen to these seedlings depending on the fire conditions, and you can sort of see one here. And then this is one at the sort of taken more recently, so post the summer, where we can see we've got a reasonable amount of growth. The concern was, well, how are they going to survive in the landscape, and is it worth taking some ex situ material? And so despite 35% of the transplanted seedlings dying, we didn't lose any plants of the nursery transplanted seedlings, so we collected seedlings at the same time. Here's an example of them in the nursery, and you can see they're a lot more vigorous because they've got nice potting mix and looked after carefully by the horticulturalists. But you can also see from the labels that we've got a lot of detail on those in terms of what populations they came from and whereabouts they were located. And one of the reasons for doing this is we're looking at creating some additional populations back in the Mt Cole area, just to spread the risk in case there's future fires. So coming back to Garryword and a Little Desert, this is a picture taken in the Little Desert 2 weeks ago. And you can see from this, if we're talking about plant recovery and seed salvaging and even cuttings, that there's probably not a lot of point going into the landscape when it's like this. And this really highlights, I guess, the need for us to prepare pre-fire and really think about what might happen. And that's one of the things that we have been doing at the gardens. So following the 2019-2020 fires, when there was a lot of funding for recovery down there, we started thinking about, well, where in the state is going to burn next and where do we need to get to? And the good thing about that is that we have had seed collecting programs, both in Garryword, Little Desert, but also up into the northwest, which hasn't yet burned. And what that meant with the Garryword fires is that a number of the taxa that were heavily impacted, we've already got seed or ex situ populations and an understanding of how to germinate the seed and produce plants to go back in the wild. But with only half the listed taxa being covered in the seed bank, there are a whole raft of species where we either don't have seed collections or we don't have knowledge about how these plants are going to respond. And I think that's one of the great things that we're learning as we go through this is how these plants respond. And I just want to touch on some work we've been doing recently, because while it's great to be collecting the seeds or collecting cuttings, creating these ex situ collections that can be used for reintroductions or augmenting existing populations, the knowledge that goes with them is really critical. So one of the groups of plants we've been doing some work on is the Swainsoners. And you can see 2 trays of Swainsoner here, both planted at the same time. The one on the left, the plants are really quite vigorous, and the one on the right, they're not very vigorous at all, and whether they would even recruit to mature plants in the wild is sort of an open question. So why are these performing so differently? Well, what it comes down to is it comes down to soil microbiome, the microbes that live in the soil. The ones on the right were seeds that were aseptically planted, and the ones on the left were inoculated with some of the native rhizobiums. So we're really starting to unpick the impact of the soil and the biome within the soil on the ability for these seeds to germinate and establish in the wild. And the Swainsoners, they have an association with these rhizobial bacteria. And what we're beginning to learn is it's not just one species. We've got at least 20 species that we've identified already, and only some of them actually provide the nutrients the plants need to really establish. So we've got a long way to go, but we're making progress. And that's one of the great things to be able to do, to generate this knowledge to conserve our really threatened flora. So I'll just wrap up there. This wouldn't have happened with a whole lot of support from a whole lot of people. Some of the pre-work we've been done has been through the DEECA Nature Fund. We've had funding through the Office for the Threatened Species Commissioner, and the gardens have a whole range of donors that support our work. That means that we can get out there and tackle these areas before we have big fire events like those we've seen in recent years. And just on the right, there's another false coloured image of a SEM, of scanning electron microscopy image of a seed. And these are being projected at our Lightscape event at the moment with QR codes. So hopefully educating some of the members of the public about our threatened flora. Thanks very much.
Thanks, David. Some beautiful photos there, I must say, but also a great overview of the really important work that the Gardens has been leading for some time now, but certainly it's been ramping up since the 2019-2020 bushfires in terms of plant conservation and seed banking and the like. So thank you.
Yep.
Okay, folks, we've got probably about 6, 7, 8 minutes for some panel questions. So my team has been trawling through the questions and we'll put some to the panel now. And the first one is for Sarah regarding the new fire risk project. So you put up some modelling there around fire risk. Has there been any previous work on the risks from fuel management regimes themselves, or comparisons between impacts of different fuel management regimes?
Sure, thanks, James. So the first part of the question is, I'll say that our models definitely help us to understand what those impacts of fire regimes might be and what different impacts of different regimes look like. And this can help us to ensure that our fire management program is, to the best of our abilities, meeting the needs of those species, but also that new work that I showed that draft risk map from is really helping us to understand in the next 12 months of the project, to understand both kind of fire management, but also conservation actions that might help mitigate that risk. So for example, there might be some small mammals that are impacted by the fire regime. And one of the conservation actions we could deliver is additional pest predator control, for example, to help those animals recover from the impacts of fire. So we don't currently have that yet, but in the next 12 months, we'll have those products.
Great, thank you. So Marcello, you mentioned the Great Australian Bird Survey. Are there future opportunities for volunteers to help monitor for native animal species and support recovery, particularly in your area in Garryowood?
Yeah, I think the Great Garryowood Bird Survey would probably be the number one. I think that'll be happening back later in September. At the moment, nothing on the cards just yet, but yeah, we might be doing future habitat pod deployments and deploying some cameras alongside those as well. So I think the best spot to look there would be with Parks Connect or the visitor and engagement team in Halls Gap. Yeah.
Right, thank you. So this one's a bit of a joint question, perhaps for David and Sarah. Was the Botanic Gardens knowledge on species fire responses incorporated into Sarah's team's decision support tools? And what more can DEECA and the Bot Gardens do to make sure that the right information's reaching the right people during an emergency? Does one of you want to have a crack at that?
I can go first. So the first part was around, did we have information about fire response in our decision support tools? And absolutely, yes. So these decision support tools are developed with both data and expert information, including things like that. And the second part of the question was around how can we ensure the right people have the right information. So one of the things that we did that I talked about in the past fire season was having that interagency collaboration group. And a key intent of that sort of group is to share and make information available in the quickest possible time to the people who need it, to implement that both during the kind of response phase of an incident, but also during the recovery phase.
Yeah, I think that.
David? Yep.
Yeah, so that's great, Sarah. And just to add, as we create knowledge or generate knowledge about, the traits that these plants have, they do get fed across. So DEECA picks them up and adds them to the trait database. Probably the big gap that we've got at the moment for plants is in the genetic space. So what are the population genetic patterns that we've got? And there is a genetic risk index that the department use, but we're building knowledge around plants at the moment. So that's a bit of a focus that the Gardens has got post 2019 fires as well. And we're up to about 35 species where we've got genetic information, and that really informs management decisions. It's being used for selecting where to take plants to reintroduce Banksia canyi back into the Burrow Pine Mountain area where it was extirpated. It was made extinct in the fires, and that sort of data is increasingly becoming available. So I think that's sort of a big area for the future.
Right, thank you. I should add that, yes, the focus on building trait information about all our species, flora and fauna, is a big priority for DEECA, and so that can really help with building our understanding of species impacts to different threats, including bushfire events.
Yep.
Sarah, you mentioned the work that you'd done for the specific needs assessment, which looked at different rainfall scenarios going forward. The question here is that should we be planning for below average or decreasing rainfall as a default, just given the experience over the recent history and perhaps forecasts into the future?
Yeah, that's a really kind of tricky question. So the context for this piece of work was experts identified that rainfall over the next 3 years was going to be critical in recovery. And so that's the kind of window. But, it's absolutely right that under a context of climate change, the past is less able to help us inform what might happen in the future. In this instance, I'd say we've identified kind of what the key trigger for recovery is, and we've got a bunch of different actions we could implement if we need to. We're just building on some of that some of the monitoring that Parks Victoria is delivering through the Grampians Arc that will help us understand when we might need to intervene if indeed rainfall continues on its current trajectory.
And there are some examples in the plant space as well. So there's a big meta study that's been done globally, and it shows only about 37% of the plant species are actually moving south in our part of the world to track the warmer, drier climate. 15% don't care, and the other 48% do go the opposite way, which is a really surprising result. But it's really a function of the difference between the realised niche, as in where the plants grow, and the potential niche of the species, and that's complicated. So it's interactions with pollinators, pathogens, and a range of other things. Some of that work's been, I can find the reference for that, and it's just popped up in the chat, and I can get that sent through.
Right. Thanks, David. Folks, we didn't get to all the questions. A really, fascinating set of presentations. So I'd like to get you to put your hands together, either virtually or real, for our presenters. So thank you, Sarah, Marcello, and David. Fantastic work. There are questions in the chat, which we can't guarantee we can get back to, but the individual presenters might be able to follow up on those. Just a reminder that our next presentation in the ARI seminars is Monday, the 21st of July. We're still waiting to confirm the topic, but we're hoping that you can join us again for that session. We've had nearly over 300 people today, which is great. And so we recognise that these seminars continue to be well attended and very popular. You can also find out about our seminar recordings on our website. I think Lauren's going to put some links in the chat there. And then we're also always very happy to get your feedback on the ARI seminar format and how we can do better, noting that today, obviously, we had a few Teams issues. For some people, it was a bit laggy, and for some people, they couldn't see the presentation. So that's a bit unfortunate, beyond our control. But thank you again, everyone, for attending. Thanks again to our three fantastic presenters. Some really informative and great work being done across the agencies in response to the fires in the West. And we look forward to seeing as many of you as possible at the next seminar. Thank you. Bye-bye.